So we have an embarrassment of riches on this panel, people who are creating, deploying, experimenting, and assessing new technologies, particularly video. And we're going to take a close look at how you all do that, and then maybe talk a little bit about how you consider and measure its impact. Justin, I want to start with you. I don't know if you missed it. I was teasing you about, give it a chance, give Facebook a chance to really, build its presence in the world. So you are a technology company that's playing a powerful role in shaping public discourse, much of that through the dissemination of news. 2/3 of your 1.6 billion users say that they get news on Facebook, that they use Facebook for news. How do you consider Facebook's role in the ecosystem of news and information?
Sure. So first of all, it's a pleasure to be here tonight, particularly in the midst of Game 7 of the World Series.
Amazing, you're here.
Anybody have the score?
3-1. 3-1.
3-1. Oh.
Nikki's there. She'll
We
just
couldn't
she'll
hear
keep
back
us.
there. Okay. So,
The Cubs.
So over the past 12 years, we have thought about ourselves as a technology company, Willow, as you articulated, that media companies are about the stories they tell. And technology companies, we think about ourselves about the tools that we build. But with that said, a lot of people are talking about the world around them, and a lot of the conversation is occurring on Facebook. So we realize we have an important responsibility. And I think we have this responsibility on a couple of dimensions. The first is to, first and foremost, to deliver to people the right stories to the right people at the right time, to give consumers and build an experience where they can engage around the world in an interesting way with their friends and family, and connect with publishers and institutions they care about. And the second responsibility is for the media industry, to build tools and technologies that allow people and allow publishers and institutions to tell the stories and connect with readers and build audiences and engage. And I think like some of the work from the work we did over the years, Jennifer at the New York Times, to the work that Raney's doing with Frontline is fascinating examples of using those tools.
Do you feel equipped as a technology to be making the kinds of editorial decisions that you are so often faced with?
Well,
and how do you do that? Give us a look inside how that works.
Sure. At a high level, what we're trying to do with our community standards is we want Facebook to be a place that is full of valuable expression, but that is also safe. And we try to balance and strike the right balance around our policies and also how we apply them. We operate at tremendous scale, that we have millions of issues that come in every day that are reported to us, that we have to kind of make decisions on whether they comply with community standards or not. And sometimes we get it wrong. I think a good example of this recently would be the terror of war. And kind of, there are good reasons, as I'm sure everyone in this room can appreciate, why you don't want child nudity on a service and why that would raise all sorts of safety concerns. Yet on the other hand, when you have an image that is global, iconic, and historic, clearly it's valuable expression in the public interest. And so we've begun thinking about how we can evolve our community standards in a way that you allow more newsworthy content, allow more content that's in the public interest and stories in the public interest, while simultaneously keeping a safe environment.
So when the tough call comes to you, do you have, where do your instincts lie in that balance between freedom of expression and creating a safe and civil zone? Do you have one?
Well, I think our overriding principles are you're looking to enable the expression and also keep a safe zone. I think context matters tremendously. Take, for example, an image of graphic or violent content. If someone's sharing that post to condemn or raise awareness of an issue, it's valuable expression and complies with our community standards and belongs on our service. If, on the other hand, you're sharing to incite violence or to glorify violence, that violates our community standards. And so the context really matters and is really important.
Mm-hmm. Raney is somebody who, working at Frontline, really thinks about context in journalism.
Well, we have these same discussions. I was just thinking how interesting that is, and our interactions with Facebook and other new technology companies is all about this right now. And so a lot of the conversations that you're having internally at Facebook, we have at Frontline, but we have a whole set of journalism standards at our essentially the tradition of how we've done journalism for decades now that we rely on and we force ourselves to think about daily. We report against our assumptions. We make sure we're fair. We have this whole discussion that's very similar. When we just did a film called Confronting ISIS, we had the same exact conversation about this Jordanian pilot situation in which he was actually burned alive by ISIS. And we had a conversation at Frontline that was very vibrant and vital about how much of that do we show. We had to show some of it, right? Because it changed politics as we know it with American relations with Jordan. So we had to show some of it to understand why the Jordanian people were so moved and horrified by that. And so we had the same discussion. We don't call it community standards, we call it journalism standards, right? Where we're looking at these issues daily and we're having same quandaries, the same ethical discussions, almost hourly at Frontline right now, especially as we move on to new platforms, new storytelling in new ways. It's challenging us in similar ways.
Jennifer, you're nodding.
Well, look, as someone who has worked at the New York Times for 20 years and before that, New York Newsday, what's the problem with being a media company? It was just an absolute, glorious role and to have, not only as an individual, but to be part of organizations really driving change. But I absolutely understand, Facebook's position, your business position, and why it's important, for Wall Street, and why it's important for business. Time on site. Time on site is very important to generate the advertising revenue that is now flowing to Google and Facebook that in the past part of it flew to publishers. But honestly, I think news organizations should have stepped up more quickly to meet the changing ways that consumers use news and information, and we have seen increasingly Instagram, Snapchat, all of these technology companies really meet the changing needs of consumers and how they're consuming news and information. But of course, with that comes responsibilities, and it will be very interesting just to see how Facebook meets those challenges and responsibilities, from standards to the First Amendment and freedom of expression. Lots of really important questions.
Any advice you'd like to offer?
Well, and
Perfect. That's the perfect answer. That's appropriate.
Excuse me, I think this means we have a score. Is that a score?
It's still 3-1, bottom of fourth.
I figured he was asking
thank
for
you.
the score.
In case you missed that, 3-1, bottom of the fourth, Chicago. So I think that there have been obviously many lessons learned and best practices developed over the years by news organizations, and they are helpful and useful ways to just consider how information should be presented.
I find it really interesting that those conversations, I don't know if you're having this too, I find that the conversations we've had with Facebook, with Google and others is just suddenly in the last year, they're starting to get really curious about how we make those decisions. They're actually asking us to come and talk to them, which is a little complicated, as you can imagine. But I think it's important for us to at least impart some of the traditions that we've come up with, because there are some reasons for why we have created these standards, these really important standards. Not that we have to stick with all of them, but I think some of them are crucial. So if you're new to these ideas, we have a lot of experience, and I feel like all of a sudden, because you've been faced with so many of these issues, we're being asked these important questions.
Yeah, well, and I think we're being asked them at a pace that's different, right? I think that we as newsrooms are still trying to deal with them. I think specifically of the Facebook Live video by Diamond Reynolds of the shooting of Philander Castillo in Minnesota. And that night of that shooting, which had come after the shooting of Alton Sterling in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, the video quickly was going viral. I think someone tagged me in the video before it was even done being broadcast, right? And so now we're having to make a video ethical decision in real time immediately about something that everyone has already seen, right? We don't necessarily have the same, there's a demand of the immediacy that is different, and an immediacy to make a decision, all right? So we're gonna write this front page story about a video before, a video that has been posted online at 9 o'clock at night, perhaps when the ethics and standards person might already be at home, without the ability to think for 24 hours or a full day, perhaps without the ability to bring, so it forces, what I think has been so fascinating, in the space that I work in very often with policing and protest and these types of issues. When Ferguson initially happened and those protests broke out, that was a world before Facebook Live, it was a world before Periscope, it was a world before Twitter video even existed. The only ways to send video in any amount of real time were Vine, RIP, and which was remarkable actually in that context. Instagram video, which was not outwardly facing in that way, it was very difficult to spread that kind of democratically, or via live streaming apps, right? And it was very interesting. I remember having a conversation with some friends at Twitter right before they purchased Periscope, and this conversation about, well, if you had any live streaming capacities, would that have helped this type of coverage? I was like, yeah, that would have been remarkably helpful.
So was live streaming and Facebook Live, is that a game changer in terms of?
I think it can. I mean, I think it's a tool in the toolbox. I mean, I think that without Diamond Reynolds pulling her phone out and clicking into her Facebook app and streaming live in real time, that officer likely doesn't get charged. We likely don't know the name of Philando Castillo. It's just another shooting we don't pay attention to. And so I think that there are, all of these. I think too often in journalism, sometimes we look at every new tool and we think this is going to be the thing that changes how we do our jobs every single day. When in reality, I think very often these tools are things that one time will change the way we do our jobs.
Because you've had a fascinating trajectory of really being on the front lines of using one app from Twitter to Periscope to Snapchat in a very short period of time. So how have these tools changed the way you cover stories, and how have they changed the way you experience stories, because you are covering them alongside participants using the very same tools to share and shape that experience?
Of course, and I think that's fascinating. I mean, I think that what the internet and social media broadly has done, these tools and mobile phones have done, is it's really democratized the news process, right? That so many of these people are in fact committing acts of citizen journalism, whether they intend to be doing that or not. They are creating content in real time and disseminating that content in real time because they want you to be able to see their experience. And so that automatically is something that both crowds the space, but also demands a higher standard and a different application in terms of how we then use those tools. What I think is important about any tool, no matter which of those it is that that we don't use the tools simply for the sake of using them, but that we think very hard about, is this the right tool for this story or for this element of this story, right? And because I think that the goal has to be, how can I tell this story from in the most three-dimensional, 360 view as possible, right? And so there are some aspects of stories that work perfectly to tell via a Snapchat story versus other.
For example.
So for example, the anniversary of Ferguson, I went back because again, between Ferguson initially and the 1 year later, you had all of these things had been invented. Periscope now existed. Snapchat now was being used for news in a way it had not been. Facebook Live wasn't quite there yet. And so Snapchat was useful for, via the story function, saying, look, you've watched this town of Ferguson on your cable news for a year. You think you know what it looks like, but maybe we can provide some more three-dimensional context. What does this place actually look like? How far is it from the police department to the spot where Michael Brown was killed? How far away was the car parked to where his body sat on the ground, right? And those were things you could do with that type of informal and feeling in that intimate video that could help provide a contextual element that perhaps was missing from the stand-up just standing in front of this place and showing you this, right? And so the first time I used Periscope was with Walter Scott, which was a fatal shooting in North Charleston, South Carolina. And that was we'd all seen the video. That was a case where video had gone viral, had been a bystander video taken on a cell phone. But it was this thought, but what you saw was, the video was based in one spot. You watched Walter Scott run away and be shot in the back. And so what I did was, Periscope, I think, premiered the week before that, right? And so what I did is I drove up to the scene for the first time as a reporter. Getting there, I started live streaming and said, hey, I'm here where Walter Scott got killed. Let's look around and see what this is. Let's get a sense of, is this 10 feet away from the road? Is it 15 feet away from a road? This is where he was standing initially, this is where he was shot, and kind of walking through that reporter's process that allows a viewer at home to get to comprehend those things that perhaps we can't capture in a photo, that perhaps it might take me 500 words to write this to explain it adequately, when I know I'm never gonna get 500 words to explain to you the geographic context of where a shooting happened, right? And so it's thinking about how can we use each of these tools in ways that they are uniquely equipped to tell parts of the story that otherwise perhaps we wouldn't capture.
So in your book, you described you're using these tools as your backdoor into covering these stories.
Very often.
Or that you also described yourself as sort of the Post's guinea pig in terms of social media. How much appetite was there on the part of your employer to let you loose with all these tools on these incredibly intense stories unfolding in real time?
It depended on the day and what exactly I decided to do with the looseness on that day. You know, but I think I think in any good newsroom, and the Post is certainly a great newsroom, there's a desire to experiment and learn and to break things in real time and then figure out how to fix them, right? And we'd seen that success. I mean, we'd seen that in Twitter previously. We understood conceptually how you could break news on Twitter, right? I've got colleagues, Robert Costa is a great example of this, who made his name during the government shutdown and the Republican leadership fights by just standing in the congressional halls and breaking little tidbits of news that never were going to necessarily make it into the story for the paper tomorrow, but that if you really cared about if the government is shut down right now, I want to know where Paul Ryan's eating lunch and who he might be talking to. And that news only really matters for 10 minutes until he stops eating lunch and goes to coffee with someone else, right? But right now, I care about that, right? And so we'd seen that success, and we'd seen that success, you know, I had colleagues, you know, who cover sports and, you know, in politics certainly, where you see that there's a built-in audience for this type of minuscule blow-by-blow. And so it's trying to figure out how can you export that, the lessons learned there, to news? How can you export that to all these other things? What was fascinating is that people have an intense interest, you know, Ferguson was a great example of this. I hadn't been on a story since the Boston Marathon bombings that people had such a real-time intense interest. They wanted to know what people were chanting right now. What they want to know, how many stores are being broken into at this exact moment, and then they want to tweet at me. Well, actually, I'm watching this live stream, and I think they are breaking into that store. No, I'm standing outside the store. They're not breaking into it. But it was a very, and so I think that was fascinating. Now there's certainly, you know, especially being a relatively young reporter in a august, esteemed newspaper newsroom. You're certainly going to have cultural clashes. You know, someone who's grown up using social media as an extension of my hand almost, right? Used to sharing and talking and interacting and doing so very honestly. That at times can rub up against this idea of how we, you know, a place like the Washington Post has a long history of not publishing anything that 19 editors haven't looked at. Both the beauty and the risk of this real-time publication, whether that be in video or in all types of other updates, is that there aren't those layers of updates. When I'm on the street in a city, I am making editorial decisions, sentence by sentence, line by line, photo by photo, that no one in real time is really getting to weigh in on, which means that, one, there has to be some trust, but two, there have to be some kind of back of the room conversations later. Oh, maybe that one we shouldn't have done. But for the most part,
Raney gave me a look on the back of the room conversations. But you're doing something very similar at Frontline with this push into VR. So share with us why VR and how your newsroom supported, resisted, or whatever combination you're experimenting in that space.
Actually, Frontline is such an interesting place because we actually started to stream our films in 2000. The moment that we were able to stream, we started to stream. So we actually didn't have to transition to digital. We were already digital. So I think we're unusual in the sense that we didn't have that cultural shift, and that was our founder, David Fanning. He was amazing. He just knew we should be everywhere way ahead of time. So when I came in, the environment was, we better figure out what the new places are to publish. So there was this idea, this expansive idea at Frontline, which is very unusual for a news organization that is usually quite protective, that we could do whatever we needed to do. And then I experienced VR for the first time at MIT. And I did a fellowship, and I highly suggested I left the newsroom for 1 day a week. It changed my life. I stepped into MIT's Media Lab and the Open Doc Lab, and I was just totally had this experience that changed me forever, which was to say that honestly it was humbling, because a lot of people in the room who were all MIT students or fellows were like, oh, television, that's still around. Oh, interesting. Are you paying attention to that out there? And the next experience at MIT was my very own son, who came with me one day and in front of the entire group of people said to me, hey, Mom. He was 8 at the time, okay? Now he's a few years older. He said, hey, Mom, why isn't Frontline more like Minecraft? And I said, for those of you who know the immersive game Minecraft, well, thanks. I'll take that under advisement to my own son, and the entire crowd clapped. And that was a wake-up call for me. So that's not to say that Frontline is Minecraft. It's to say that in my evolution as the person leading Frontline, I had both the environment around me telling me something needed to be challenged, and the way we were telling stories that we had to expand. And like you said, Wesley, I really do believe that VR is one toolkit. I don't believe that Once Upon a Time is gone, that linear storytelling is gone. I just believe that VR changed the way that I could see story. And actually, we're so fortunate because Knight believes in this too, and we're now able to really explore this. And today, just today, I was seeing things that I had never seen with our partners at Emblematic and XRES, and they were showing me how we could see environments in a way that I think are pretty changing for the medium. And if you haven't seen this type of work, I highly recommend the walk around VR experiences. And now, because we're public media, we're publishing on Facebook and their 360 player, and that has really expanded our audience. And so we believe in the form, but we also believe in reaching new people through this form. And so it reaches both those things and those aspirations.
And we should point out that Emblematic Group is here. And
yes, they're here, and they're showing some of our
demos.
work and their own work outside, and they're amazing.
So the Ebola outbreak was the first
yes.
Story that you did that you told in VR. Why did you choose VR for that story?
So I was at MIT and I needed a project. So I said, you know, actually Ebola was one of the most important stories to me at that time, and we worked very quickly on that. And the metabolism of Frontline has changed greatly, where we rushed to film out right away once we started to see the Ebola virus take off. Then we said, let's go back to West Africa and see what's happened. We sent back a very technically savvy director who said to me, I will take this project on and I will see what this means. And we actually did a very rudimentary VR experiment. And we actually then married it with 2D footage. And that was, at the time, pretty radical, I have to say. Now we look at it, and Carla Boras, who's the head of digital for Frontline, is here, and we both cringe a little bit at that. That was only a couple of years ago, mind you, that we have come so far since then. But it told us, it showed us that people responded to that in a different way than they did to our linear film. And so that opened up this whole new discussion for us.
So Jennifer, what do you, when you look at the sort of news landscape largely, what do you think is the potential for VR?
Well, VR offers great opportunity to not only create empathy with its storytelling, because it brings users right into the experience, which I learned partly from USC professor Robert Hernandez during the times I visited. Robert's excellent class. But also outrage, and that's very important today, because there's much that needs to be changed. And as Raney was describing earlier, your work today and what you're seeing that you're able to produce to really convey the impact of climate change.
Right, so we have trouble, Jennifer and I were talking about this, really doing linear films about climate change. People tend to turn off, we turn off, right? And so we are doing this remarkable project with a night grant with Emblematic and Extras, where we're actually going to Greenland with photogrammetry. In this case, it's really going there so that we can show you about the warming oceans. That sounds really dull until you're in the environment and you're standing there and the Arctic ice is cracking in front of you and you hear from
Then
the
it's like
NASA
Minecraft.
scientists. Then it's like Frontline's version of Minecraft, which will never make
Everyone
my
get
son
your
happy,
wood.
but that's okay until he's older, but that's cool. But yeah, it was these remarkable experiences of saying that's a different way to tell a story so that people are awakened, you know, and that's the same thing as empathy in the sense of that's really our job as journalists, is to educate and inspire and to do meaningful work. And now we're able to do meaningful VR. What I mean by that is you aren't just swimming with the dolphins. As much as I love swimming with the dolphins in VR, we want to then we want to layer intelligence and thought in that. And
how do you, sorry.
Well, yeah, no, I mean, that's what these new technologies allow you to do, like 8i and other technologies that allow you to actually film someone and then place them in this experience, in this volumetric experience where you're walking around. Now, if you haven't experienced this, it's very hard to talk about it, but actually Emblematic is here so you could experience it, and I really encourage you to do that, because until I really didn't know the power of it or why this mattered. And in fact, even today I was being shown new things and I was just, you know, really it's quite interesting to just have the experience.
And what's exciting is the idea about bringing Nani de la Pena and the wonderful team of Emblematic together with Frontline was to not only create incredibly important, compelling content, but also to explore many of the very important ethical questions that VR and that 360-degree video raises. So
right, I mean, tons of big standards in journalism conversations happen almost hourly. I see Jamie in the crowd too from Emblematic, and Nani's here as well. We all come from the journalism tradition. We just look at it differently. So we assume that we understand each other until we don't. And that's one of the most interesting experiences that I've had professionally, is to understand, oh wait, no, you didn't understand what I meant, did you? And they're saying back to me, oh no, you didn't understand what we meant. And so that's the crux of this, and we'll be publishing a set of standards that we think will hopefully be helpful for people making journalistic VR. We don't think there'll be standards for everybody, but we do think that there'll be some of the things that we've learned along the way that should be helpful.
So before we go to audience questions, I'd just like to ask you all this one thing. When you think about what these new tools allow you to do in terms of impact they have, what excites you most?
Well, to me, this has been a fascinating discussion, which almost typifies what excites me most, which is when we build a product, whether it's VR or 360 or something like Facebook Live, if you had told me 6 to 9 months later, some of the most exciting moments on the product would range from Chewbacca Mom to a person climbing Trump Tower to an attempted coup in Turkey to Bill Murray singing Take Me Out to the Ball Game this week in the 7th inning stretch at Wrigley, to putting something in the hands of people to shine a spotlight on the relationship between the Black community and police. It's humbling. And I mean, that's what most excites me, because the feedback we get from these sorts of discussions and from these forums informs what we're building, and then to the point, and the different ways in which these tools get used. So that's what kind of really excites me.
Well, it's quite earnest to say that we hope that journalism really causes and incites dialogue, right, and meaningful dialogue, and that's what Frontline's all about, is the meaning behind the work. So what we hope is that these different ways of telling stories will reach new people and have new conversations and hopefully change lives, in the sense that we hope people are educated and can do something with what they learn. And they do, and we know this is true. So the more places we can be authentically, I think the better.
Of course. I mean, I think that so much of it is, as both someone who produces news as well as someone who's a massive news consumer, is waiting to see when the right story finds the right technology at the right time. Because in those moments is where you see the journalism that changes the world, is where you watch a coup happen in Turkey in real time, right? And I think that is what's so, with each of these technologies, whether it be VR, whether it be live streaming, some of them we've had those moments for, and others we know that we're all still playing with it, we're figuring it out. I'm waiting to have the VR experience that changes my life, right? And I know it will happen because there are enough people working in this space and working at it. And when that hits and when that finds the right, like I said, the right story at the right time with the right technology, I do really think that these new technologies are really powerful.
So at Knight Foundation, our mission is to advance journalistic excellence in the digital age. And what excites me most about Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp is the opportunity that these platforms have created for ordinary people to become journalists. And to me, that is the single biggest opportunity. And for journalists to help amplify voices of people who are sharing important stories about their communities. And they're great tools for journalists to listen and to learn more, to be more relevant. We have to learn how to be more relevant. Trust is what journalism has to focus on in the aftermath of this election, rebuilding trust. And I think that that journalism and journalists have a great opportunity to embrace these technology platforms to accomplish those two things.
Great, thank you. So we're going to go to the audience for questions. We have mics stationed, so if you raise your hand, we'll get a mic over to you. Anybody has? I'm going to start here because you're right there.
Should we ask for the score first?
5-1.
Whoa.
5-1 Cubs.
Keeps
A
getting
lot has
worse.
happened during this panel.
What inning is it?
Fifth. Okay, anything could happen. I'm a Red Sox fan, just
Wesley's
saying.
a
I'm a Red
Cleveland
Sox
fan.
fan.
Wesley, I had a question for you. I
Well, now
was
I'm
a
depressed about the
journalist
Indians.
for many years.
But I'm going to try to answer.
I'm sorry. I'm a Cubs fan, sorry.
Oh, well, then I'm not taking your
I
question.
grew up there. And forgive me for not knowing all of your work. So
Oh, it's fine.
when I used to work in newsrooms, we'd talk about, the daily stuff and the big takeouts. Do you come back then with all this rich firsthand stuff and do the takeouts yourself? Or are you the on-the-ground fast guy and somebody else is doing it and maybe you're feeding color? How does it work from there?
So the goal is to be both, depending on the story. And so there are stories where I am the guy in the ground sending feeds in, and then someone way smarter and a better writer than me makes it all pretty and makes it work, right? There are other times where it's a little bit of both. And what's been fascinating, especially covering one relatively constantly viral beat now for 2 years, it's been interesting to get to experiment and figure out how to do this in different ways, right? And so, for example, I have now given up on live protest coverage. I'm not going to march around for 3 hours live tweeting everything that's going to happen, because having done that for miles and miles and night to night, you get a lot of retweets, but it becomes a little, it seems a little futile, right? And so with each event, I try to be deliberate about any use of journalism, whether that's on my Twitter feed or elsewhere. How can I be deliberate to make sure I'm telling a story? And so a good example of this is Charlotte, where there were protests and a night of rioting following a police shooting earlier this summer. And I was the senior reporter on the ground, so I was very often the person collecting everything and writing it. But I also, as one of the people with a larger social media following, especially on this specific issue, I knew I needed to be populating those spaces. And so one thing I tried to do, in addition to writing the feature story and also breaking some of the news for us in Charlotte, which meant that a lot of my days were not at the press conference or not out in the street, but working the phones and at my computer, going out at night, and I did something that I wish I had figured out to do a long time ago, but a long time ago, figured out the power when you're covering something live of doing these little vignettes, right? You take someone's picture or a little video of them, you say who they are, what their name is, a quote from them, and people like that. What what we should have hacked a long time ago is the Twitter character limit around that, right? Like it never quite made sense. And so what we finally figured out with, the ability to use 4 different photos is you can take a photo of someone or 2 photos of someone, and you can literally in real time transcribe full paragraphs of what they said. So tell me, 18-year-old who's flown down from New York to join this protest in real, full, complete sentences in a way that can be affecting why you're here and why you felt the need to come out. And so we did that in a series, kind of these Charlotte protesters in their own words, not just sound bites, not just quick clips, but literally full transcribing 5-minute interviews with them, more than ever would have made it into the article, more context than we ever would have otherwise. And so it's trying to think about, like I said, with each story now, like I said, I'm playing a different role depending on the time. With Dallas or Baton Rouge, I was the guy at my desk working the phones, feeding to people. Other times I'm the guy in the street. But in all of these instances, how can we best use these built-in platforms that we have to tell stories in unique ways that are value added? Most of those people never made it into any story in the Washington Post. But their stories were, but many of their stories were viewed tens of thousands of times. And so how can we, like I said, use these different platforms to supplement the journalism we're doing otherwise?
And knowing that level of detail must add a richness then when you go back to do the bigger.
Of course, because you sit down to write and you need to describe these crowds in 2 sentences or 3 sentences, right? But you've had these, social media very often, there's a balance between using it as a platform upon which to publish finished journalism and platforms upon which that are extensions of your notebook. And I very often see social media as an extension of my notebook. If I take this picture and put this quote up, I now, when I go back to sit down, know exactly where I was standing when I interviewed this person, exactly what time it was, because there's a timestamp on it. I know when in the sequence of the night it happened, right? It was between when I watched that building get looted and between when we marched through here, because this is where it fits in my timeline, right? And so I think that, again, it's so much of what we do public-facing can be this transparent attempt to both allow people to see our process, but also for our own use. There's so many nights when I go to sit down and write about the last 24 hours, the last 36 hours, and I'm literally going through my own tweets or going through my own Facebook statuses to see these different reporters' cues that 10 years ago would have been little delineations in my notebook.
Thank you. Got it. There you go. It's making its way to you.
Hi, guys. So Jennifer, to kind of piggyback on the comment that you made about trust, basically, and journalistic integrity, I feel like with tech companies kind of crossing or blurring that line on media and the paradox of the internet, where people get most of their information, but also you can't trust everything that you read on the internet. How do we kind of resolve that, especially in light of the election? How do you, as journalists, and how does a tech company kind of rebuild that trust with the public and understanding, what we can trust and what we can't?
Well, whoever has an answer to that question, Knight Foundation will fund it. Because that is, I think all of us would agree, the most important question facing journalism. I don't think it's technology anymore. I think journalists have embraced technology, and I think journalism news organizations have really aggressively tried to, as I said earlier, respond to the changing needs of consumers by using technology more effectively. So I do think it's trust, and I don't know what the answer is, but I do wonder if there might be an opportunity with working with technology / media companies to help address it together, because there's too much at stake, not just for journalism, but for all of us, for our country, for our democracy. And at Knight Foundation, it's an informed community, is an engaged community, and helping people be informed is what we have to figure out how to do better than we have in the past.
Great. Do we have time for one more? One more question. Back here. Thank you.
Hi. My question is about how you sort of measure success, right? Because historically, all the traffic came to your story, and your editor, the business owners would ask how many views it got, and you monetize those views. And in this increasingly sort of disaggregated, Uber syndicated world where your notebook's on Twitter, but it's not being monetized on Twitter, and your the photo, you know, whatever photos you put on Instagram are going to have more views than however many page views you're generated for the story that might have taken you 1,000 times more time. What does success look like? How do we know? I mean, is the business going to follow? Is the business model going to change to adapt to the way that people are actually consuming the story?
Well, I would say one pass to one really good sign, Justin, was when Facebook agreed to pay millions of dollars to news organizations to experiment with Facebook Live. So that was a good sign, but the business model is broken. And for quality journalism to be sustained, you do have to pay for it, right?
Right, I think so. I do think there are great models that are starting to pop up for real investigative journalism in the nonprofit space. So you see that with Frontline. We are a nonprofit. You see that with ProPublica. You see it with the Center for Investigative Reporting. You see these units that are starting to convene around the idea that investigative, really deep journalism has to be part of the public interest that we all buy into, that we think about, that maybe commercial media is not the only answer to trusted journalism. So I'm not saying commercial media goes away. It has got to figure out a new business plan. I know it will, and it's really making huge gains in this way as well. But there is a space now for nonprofit journalism that I think is burgeoning and growing.
Sure. I mean, look at the Panama Papers investigation.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, and I think that, and I'm certainly not the business person here at all, right? But I think to something that Jeff Bezos says very often when he's interviewed, our benevolent uncle Jeff Bezos, he talks a lot about, when he's asked about Amazon video streaming and their programs, he talks very often about how they choose which series to fund through Amazon Studios. And he says that we want all of our shows to be someone's favorite show. And so a lot of the shows perhaps wouldn't get produced by CBS or NBC because when you're talking about cable or network television, you're fine producing shows that are a bunch of people's third favorite show, but perhaps not your favorite show. The show that you watch when it's on because nothing else. I love Law & Order. It's not my favorite show, right? And so he talks about that, and I see some overlap there with kind of the mindset around how we as individual journalists and individual brands, therefore, use these tools, right? I think that we obviously have to have a conversation or be thinking about how this potentially is monetized. But in the same way, I could waste my entire life trying to figure out how to turn 400,000 Twitter followers into money. I'm not quite sure how that works other than literally like whoring myself on the internet. How does that work, right? But I also know...
That's why you wrote a book.
Correct, right?
It's coming out in 2 weeks.
Well, yeah, but I'm talking about money for Washington Post.
Yeah, I know.
But I've got an email from a reader at my desk above my monitor, and it's someone who wrote in who said, today I renewed my subscription to the Washington Post because of Wesley Lowery's coverage in Ferguson. We've gotten Twitter, my colleague David Farenthold, who's led the reporting on the Trump Foundation and has really used this social media tools to supplement that reporting. I see tweets every single day. Well, today I renewed my Washington Post subscription because of David Farenthold. How do you build a news organization that is full of a lot of people's favorite reporters, right? Because I won't be everyone's favorite reporter. I'll be a lot of people's least favorite reporter. But I'll be someone's favorite reporter. And will that person, hopefully that person plus, not just my mom, but someone additionally to her, hopefully those people will subscribe, and those people, David Weigel will be someone's favorite reporter, and Bob Costa will be someone's favorite reporter, and David Farenthold will be someone's favorite reporter, and Karen Tumulty will be someone's favorite reporter. And how do we build a newsroom, a collective of that, and how do we become people's favorite reporters? By being real humans to them, through our Snapchat and our Instagram and our Twitter.
It may just be the way to restore trust, right?
Yeah, well, exactly.
One favorite reporter at a time.
Correct.
Yes.
Let's hope.
Because you do great work.
Well, I think it's right. It's the journalism that you're doing
Yeah.
as well. So it's the act of journalism. It's being human plus you're delivering on journalism.
Well, and letting people see
So there's
the
meaning.
journalism process.
But
as
one of
well.
the things that you said I thought was interesting is one way that we've really shifted, and because we're broadcasters first, is now we're thinking about success in a different way, is that it's how does your community engage? So on Facebook, we used to focus only on views. Now we're focusing on how many people share, and what do they say, and how do they comment? And so that's a totally different way for journalists to start thinking about, business people to start thinking about the impact of the work that we have. So if you're motivated to share, then that's more valuable than if you're watching for 30 seconds. So if you watch and you share, which is what happens to your work all the time, and our best work, then you can start to see a community building. And so I think it's taking more time to look at your audience and actually think about them and watch what they're doing. And that's been amazing. It's changed us so much than just looking at a rating or looking at the views on Facebook.
Yeah, and I'd say we think about it in terms of the tools that we build, which are what are the tools that align with business models, whether it's instant articles or live, that allow institutions to build successful businesses, but also what are the tools we're giving to reporters to allow you to tell your stories in richer and deeper ways that connect and engage audiences. And we think about both.
Jennifer, Wesley, Raney, Justin, thank you very much for doing an extraordinary job today, and hope to see you again. Thank you.